Hey everyone, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, continuing our Thousand Suns awesome journey. Welcome fellow sorcerers. Today's video we are taking a look 9th edition Mutalith Vortex Beast. One of the scariest models to paint in my opinion. This was a painting challenge. I believe I've got a video on how I painted the MVB. He is a awesome weird model that transitioned across from the fantasy range of models, like quite a few units within the Thousand Suns Codex. But is he what he should be? I'm assuming gender here. Is it what it should be in our 9th edition Thousand Suns army list? Let's go and take a look. So of course, as usual in this series, we're going to kick off with the base stats of the Mutalith. Just on screen, if anyone has not seen one before and you didn't clock the thumbnail, this is what they look like. A big tentacled blob with a giant vortex type thing on its back, and it's got big monstrous claws and lots of tentacles and tails. Its base statistics then is a move of 10 inch, a weapon skill of 3+, a ballistic skill of 4+, strength 7, toughness 7, 14 wounds, 5 attacks, a leadership of 7 and a save of 4+. Comes in at 7 power level or 145 points depending which way you play the game, and there are no other upgrades that you can do to it. You can't replace any options. There's no other things to switch around which is going to increase power level or points. What you see is what you get. And of course, being a model with greater than 10 wounds, it comes with a degrading profile. In the case of the Mutalith Vortex Beast then, as it takes damage, it loses movement, weapon skill, and the number of Vortex Powers that it can use. Now, we'll get onto Vortex Powers a little bit later into the video. But starting off with 8+ wounds remaining, it has a move of 10 and a weapon skill of 3+, as shown on the screen. However, when it drops down between 4 and 7 wounds remaining, that movement statistic drops to 8 inches and its weapon skill increases or decreases, whichever you will look at it, becomes less effective and becomes a 4+. And then finally, when it's really beaten down, 1 to 3 wounds remaining, has a move of 6 and a weapon skill of 5+. Now going back to those Vortex Powers, at full power, 2 Vortex Powers can be used. 4 to 7 wounds, it drops to just 1 power, and then when it's really degraded, it has no ability to use any of its powers at all. As I mentioned, what you see is what you get. So it comes equipped with a Tentacled Maul, which is a melee weapon, so it's only a range of melee, type melee, strength user, so that is a strength of 7, an AP -1 and 1 damage. But each time an attack is made with this weapon, you make 3 hit rolls instead of 1. So that attack characteristic of 5, you are going to increase that by a factor of 3. Alternatively then, you can use the Mutalith Claws. Again, a melee type weapon, a strength of +1, so that gives it a strength of 8, an AP of -2 and a flat 3 damage. So the first one then, when you're using the Tentacled Maul, is when you're targeting lots of low powered stuff and you're trying to get through a lot of churn, whereas you want to go with the claws when you're attacking things that are that little bit tougher. So you go from 15 attacks by default down to just 5, but you are causing that flat 3 damage, which is huge in Warhammer 40k this day and age. The Mutalith comes with a number of abilities. The first one then is the Aura of Dark Glory. This gives the model a 5+ invulnerable save. For those that are not aware of how people sort of write down invulnerable save, when you see my screen there, 5++ indicates an invulnerable save. The Mutalith also comes with Mutant Regeneration, so in your command phase, the model regains D3 lost wounds. So very similar then to how demon engines work, like the Forge Fiend or the Mauler Fiend, where they have Infernal Regeneration and that regains them 1 lost wound per turn. The Mutalith actually has a different ability because he's not a demon, but gains D3 per command phase instead. So a good chance of getting him out of those low level brackets where he's movement and weapon skill and vortex powers have been decreased. Next up then is Warp Explosion. Now a lot of creatures, especially the larger ones, tend to explode on a d6 roll of a 6 when they've lost their last wound. However, the Mutalith does implode quite largely, and his explosion occurs on a 4+, and all models, friend or foe, within 6 inches of the Mutalith when that happens, suffer D3 mortal wounds per unit. Finally, we get onto the more interesting thing then, and that is Warp Vortex. Now, this is what makes this creature a little bit different to all the other monsters that we can get in Warhammer 40k. So the Warp Vortex gives you a bunch of different powers that occur in the shooting phase. Now, it's quite critical to remember this occurs in the shooting phase. It's not a psychic power in any way, so it cannot be denied by psychic shenanigans. And we'll cover each of those Warp Vortex powers in a second, but the last bit we want to go through then is the faction keywords. So that is Chaos, Tzeentch, Heretic Astartes, Thousand Suns, and can be part of a great cult. And then keywords, Monster, Mutalith Vortex Beast. Very important to note those keywords because the way that this model can work outside of it being a demon, because it's not a demon, so it works differently to a Forge Fiend because of any of those restrictions. So you just got to be a bit conscious of some of those different keywords. Now, Vortex powers have changed quite significantly since the last codex. The last codex, you'd pick a power or you'll randomly roll for 2 powers, and on a 2+, those powers would go off, and they'd typically be buffing or debuffing type powers. I used to use them a lot with a combination of Zangor for increasing AP and strength and so on, but now very different. So you get 2 powers to start with at your full abilities, and then, as I mentioned, as you get bracketed in damage, you drop to 1 power at 4 to 7 wounds, and then no powers at 1 to 3. So in your shooting phase then, the model can use a number of Vortex powers as specified, we just mentioned. Each time a model does so, select one of the powers below that has not been used by a friendly model during this turn and resolve its effects. So if you've got one model, you can't use the same power twice on the same model. If you're running 2 Mutalith Vortex Beasts or more, again, you can't use the same power more than once. So quite limiting, which does lead you to the conclusion that should you take more than 1 Mutalith Vortex Beast like you might have done before, the answer is probably not. So let's go through each of these powers then. The first one, Immaterial Flare. 1 enemy unit within 18 inches and visible. So just think very similar to psychic powers in the way that you look at them for your enemy targets, but they are not psychic powers. You don't roll psychic tests. Roll a d6 per model in that unit and it will take a mortal wound on a 6. So obviously then, the bigger the unit with model count, the more chances you're going to get those 6s. So this really is one to use on those big orc hordes, for example. That's where you're going to be using this particular power. Next up then is Turbulent Discharge. You find your closest enemy unit within 18 inches and once again visible to the model, and then you roll 1d6. On a 2 to 4, that unit suffers d3 mortal wounds, and on a 5+, it suffers a flat 3 mortal wounds. So note then that a 1 is automatically going to fail at this point. So 2 to 4, d3, and then 5+ is a flat 3 mortal wound output. The third power then is Maelstrom of Madness. So roll 1d6 for each enemy unit within 9 inches of this model, and on a 2+, that unit suffers a flat mortal wound. This was a carryover, I think, from the previous edition. There was a very similar ability for that every unit within 9 inches takes a mortal wound on that 2+. So that one has remained. Now, really, really handy because that could be characters that are not the nearest and so on. So if you've got a lot of enemy units that are getting a bit close, can be quite useful for picking off those odd single wounds that are remaining on various units. So quite a very good utilitarian ability, that one. Finally then, we've got one that's probably more targetable towards vehicles and so on. So this is Beam of Unreality. So this is an enemy unit that has 10 or more wounds in its characteristic and within 24 inches and visible to the model. So quite a good range on this one as well. Roll 1d6 and you -1 from the result for enemies that are aircraft keyworded, and you add 1 to the enemy unit that has Titanic keyword. So you're less likely to damage a flyer and more chance of damaging something that's big, hence Titanic. On a 3 to 4 then, that unit suffers d3 mortal wounds, and on a 5+, that unit suffers d6 mortal wounds. So obviously you can compare and contrast that to a baby smite and a full powered super smite. So d3 on a 3 to 4. So if you are targeting an aircraft though, that is obviously going to be a bit more difficult to get off. But against Titanic, you're going to be causing d6 mortal wounds basically on a 4+. So far more chance, 50-50 of getting a d6 mortal wound output. So that's the model on its own. Let's take a look at any stratagems and psychic powers and other things that were within our abilities to make this a little bit more effective. The first obvious one then is Empiric Reservoir, because that is a stratagem specifically for the Mutalith Vortex Beast. For 1 CP then, use this stratagem at the start of your psychic phase. Select one model from your army within 6 inches of a friendly Mutalith, and if that model generates Cabal points, it generates D3 additional Cabal points for that pool. Now, I've covered all the Cabal point stuff in other videos, and I'll see if I can remember to leave a link in the description below. We also have a second stratagem specific to the Mutalith as well, and that's Etheric Saturation. Use this stratagem in your psychic phase when a psychic character from your army is within 12 inches of a friendly Mutalith, and that is selected to manifest psychic powers. Instead of manifesting one of those psychic powers with that model, it is healed and regains up to D3 lost wounds. So basically it's channeling the psychic aura around the Mutalith and can help regen it, and that will cost you 1 CP. Now, there are no relics or infernal packs that can really benefit the Mutalith, so we move straight on to psychic powers. And there's going to be a few commonalities between these and demon engines to an extent. So the first one, Glamour of Tzeentch, is obviously going to work because it's all friendly Thousand Suns units within 18 inches of a psyker. And each time an attack is made against that unit, they are -1 against your Mutalith. Second up then is Temple Manipulation. Now this works on a Mutalith but doesn't work on our vehicles or demon engines because it targets everything except vehicles. So models within 12 inches of a psyker, that model is healed and regains D3 lost wounds. So you can heal up the Mutalith through psychic powers. And just like everybody else, it can benefit from Weaver of Fates, and that gives you the 4+ invulnerable save. So it comes with that 5+, but you can increase that with Weaver of Fates. Moving into the discipline of Vengeance then, Presage, however you want to pronounce it, Presage, is Blessing Power, and that is a warp charge of 7. And you can cast it on the Mutalith, and that will give it a +1 to attack. Now, obviously, it only attacks in the melee phase or in the close combat phase. Has no benefit to shooting. So normally you would be applying that to something that's going to benefit from both, or in most cases, something that's going to shoot is normally the place to do it. But of course, it can be situational, and you may find that you want to use it on the Mutalith. Interestingly, the Mutalith can also be swelled by the warp. So that with a warp charge of 6. Friendly Thousand Suns models within 12 inches of a psyker. Until the start of your next psychic phase, you add 2 to the model's strength characteristic and 1 to its attacks characteristic. So that will take him up to strength 9 with 6 attacks, which can be quite tasty given some of the Tentacle Maw and Mutalith Claw abilities. So realistically, your Mutalith Claws will then be strength 10, which is quite important against a lot of these toughness 5 big marine type models that have got lots of wounds on them. So yeah, can be very situational, but as he is a bit of a close combat monster, could be very, very handy. Sadly though, he cannot be affected by Temporal Surge, so we can't sling him forward with that double move, unfortunately, because it only affects infantry, cavalry and beasts, and unfortunately the Mutalith is a monster, despite its name. And that is pretty much all you can do with the Mutalith. You can't give it too much cool additional powers or buffs to make it that little bit better than what it is straight out of the box. A lot of those powers and other things you're probably going to be using on your Scarab Occult Terminators or other units. So realistically, this thing is probably going to be running a bit solo. You certainly don't want to be keeping it hanging around your own models because of that 4+ explosion factor. So you are going to be wanting to sling it into combat as quickly as possible and then use lots of mortal wound output. It has a big capability of putting out mortal wounds, and that is one of the big strengths of the Thousand Suns, obviously. The big phrase everyone uses for things like this is the distraction Carnifex. So a model that your opponent can't really afford to ignore and is going to have to concentrate a lot of resources to do, but it's not going to cost you 1,000,000 points worth of loss should it go down early doors. So a very good option in my opinion. I don't think it's competitive, but I think it's a very, very flavourful, very, very fun model. It's got a good ability to put out lots of mortal wounds very easily. That 10-inch movement, no degrading ability on the number of attacks that it can put out means it can get into combat fairly quickly. It's not stupidly big that you can't necessarily hide it from turn 1 alpha strikes, so it's going to give you some good utility. As mentioned earlier, you're only realistically going to be running 1 of these in an army now. You might have wanted to run 2 perhaps previously, but 145 points, it packs a punch. It's got some great monster type stats, it's got some good wounds, it's got some speed, and once it gets into combat, it should do pretty well. And on top of that, the psychic mortal wounds, which you normally be putting out from a Thousand Suns player, you're putting them out in the shooting phase. So as mentioned, they can't be denied in that same kind of way. They would need a feel no pain type ability that would ignore damage, which is very different. Now with the new odd weapons like railguns that have been given their adjustment these days, I think if you haven't seen this, railguns now ignore invulnerable saves. Are you going to be overly worried about that? Well, it depends on your local gaming group. Are you going to be facing loads of Tau players? Now, realistically, probably not. But again, there's lots of other things for them to be worried about with railguns floating around. So I wouldn't overly worry about it. I think it's a great fun model. It's a beauty to paint, even if it's a little bit scary and daunting to do so. But I hope that this video gives you a little bit more insight, a little bit more in-depth visibility, some ideas that you might not have thought about if you were considering putting one into your army. So there we go then, folks. That is my opinion on the Mutalith Vortex Beast. I love getting pictures out of him, which is why I love making these videos, digging out some of my favourite photos of some of the models I've painted in my amassed collection of Thousand Suns. So forgive my indulgence to an extent. Mutalith, the distraction Carnifex of the Thousand Suns. Yeah, I think it has a place, but it's taking up points that are probably going to be spent elsewhere. But I think it's chomping at the bit to get into a list. And should we see forthcoming changes to Volkite weapons or anything else that might come along, I think it's in there for. It used to be a bit of a fun unit, you know, but now I think it actually has a valuable place because of some of the abilities and strats and everything else that can be used with it because of its keywords. It does fit a brief not filled by other demon engines. So that's my thoughts, and as always, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on the MVB, the Mutalith Vortex Beast? Have you had any success with it in games? If so, I'd love to hear from you. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all on the next video.